The war had been over for 2 months. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. Every German military unit had laid down its arms. Every German ship had either been sunk, scuttled, or turned over to Allied control. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's once formidable navy, no longer existed. Yet here, in the cold waters off Argentina, thousands of miles from any European port, a German U-boat was surfacing as if the war had never ended. The submarine made no aggressive moves. It didn't dive again. It simply sat on the surface, diesels running, making its way slowly toward the harbour. As word spread through Mar del Plata, crowds began gathering along the waterfront. Argentine naval vessels scrambled to intercept. Within an hour, patrol boats surrounded the U-boat, their guns trained on its conning tower. The submarine continued its approach, unhurried, inevitable. When it finally came alongside the dock, a hatch opened. A young man emerged, climbing down from the conning tower. He was 24 years old, bearded, his uniform salt-stained and faded. His name was Otto Vermuth. He was an Oberleutnant in the German Navy, commander of U-530. Behind him came his crew, 53 men, most barely into their 20s. They looked exhausted. They looked defeated. They looked like men who had been at sea far too long. Vermuth addressed the Argentine naval officers in German. His message was translated quickly. He was surrendering his submarine and his crew to Argentine authorities. They had been at sea for 86 days. They had come from Norway. They were seeking asylum. They carried no weapons, no cargo, nothing but the men themselves and the fuel remaining in their tanks. Argentine authorities took the crew into immediate custody. The submarine was secured under armed guard. Within hours, the news was transmitted to Buenos Aires, then to Washington, London, and Moscow. Allied intelligence officers boarded planes bound for Argentina. Journalists descended on Mar del Plata from around the world. And the questions began. Questions that would never be fully answered. Questions that would spawn conspiracy theories lasting 80 years. Where had this U-boat been for 86 days? What had it been doing during the nearly 3 months since Germany's surrender? Why had it sailed halfway around the world to Argentina rather than surrendering in Europe? What had happened to its weapons, its documents, its war diary? And most urgently, most desperately asked by intelligence officers who had spent years hunting Nazi war criminals, what cargo had it carried across the Atlantic? Because when Argentine inspectors examined U-530, they found the cargo holds empty. The torpedo tubes contained no weapons. The crew quarters showed no signs of having carried passengers beyond the standard crew complement. Whatever the submarine had carried when it left Norway, if it had carried anything beyond standard provisions and fuel, was gone. Disposed of at sea, Vermuth claimed. Jettisoned to lighten the boat for the long voyage. Standard procedure, he insisted. But nothing about U-530's voyage was standard. And when a second German U-boat, U-977, surfaced in the same Argentine harbour 5 weeks later with an almost identical story, the mystery transformed into something larger, darker, more persistent. It became the foundation for legends about Hitler's escape, about Nazi treasure shipped to South America, about secret bases in Antarctica where the Reich continued in hiding. It became one of the Cold War's most enduring mysteries, a story where the gaps in documented history were filled with speculation that refused to die. This is the true story of what happened, the story of 2 German submarines that vanished as the Third Reich collapsed and reappeared in Argentina, bearing desperate men and unanswered questions. It's a story about the chaos of war's end, about young men facing impossible choices, about fear and hope and survival in the final days of the greatest conflict in human history. And it's a story about how facts and myths become so entangled that even decades of investigation can't fully separate them. To understand why Otto Vermuth made the decision to sail to Argentina, we need to understand what was happening to the German Navy in the spring of 1945. By April, Germany's military situation was beyond desperate. Soviet forces had captured Berlin and were hunting through the rubble for Hitler. Anglo-American armies had crossed the Rhine and were racing eastward through what remained of the Reich. German cities were burning. The transportation network had collapsed. Fuel had run out. Food supplies were failing. The German state itself was disintegrating. Within weeks, it would cease to exist entirely. The Kriegsmarine had been dying for years. The great surface fleet that Germany had built to challenge British naval supremacy had been systematically destroyed. The battleships Bismarck and Scharnhorst were on the ocean floor. The Tirpitz had been bombed to scrap in a Norwegian fjord. The Graf Spee had been scuttled off Uruguay. Smaller vessels had been sunk, captured, or were trapped in ports they could never leave. Only the U-boat force remained operational, and even that force was a fraction of its former strength. At its peak in 1943, over 400 U-boats had operated across the world's oceans, hunting Allied convoys, sinking millions of tons of shipping, nearly strangling Britain's lifeline. But by 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. Allied technology had advanced beyond anything Germany could counter. Radar, sonar, code breaking, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, all had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground for U-boats. 3 out of every 4 U-boat crewmen who went to sea during the war never returned. It was the highest casualty rate of any military service in any nation during World War II. Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded what remained of the U-boat force. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. In his final political testament, he appointed Dönitz as his successor. For exactly 8 days, from May 1st to May 8th, Dönitz led what remained of Germany. Historians call this brief period the Flensburg government, named for the northern German city, where Dönitz established his administration. His task was simple and terrible: negotiate surrender terms with the Allies while trying to save as many German military personnel and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. The U-boat force faced an impossible situation. Most submarines were in German or Norwegian ports when the surrender order came. Dönitz issued clear instructions. All U-boats were to surface immediately, fly black flags of surrender, and proceed to designated Allied ports, where they would be turned over to British or American forces. Any submarine that failed to comply would be hunted down and sunk. The Allies were unequivocal. Crews who obeyed would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Those who resisted would be treated as pirates and likely executed. Most U-boat commanders obeyed. In the days following Germany's surrender, over 100 submarines surfaced and made their way to Allied ports. Their crews were taken prisoner. The submarines themselves were eventually scuttled in Operation Deadlight, deliberately sunk in deep water off Ireland and Scotland to prevent them from ever threatening Allied shipping again. It was an ignominious end for a force that had nearly won the war. But not every submarine received the surrender order. Some were at sea, operating under strict radio silence in distant waters. Others received the orders but faced commanders who refused to accept them. And some crews, particularly those who had witnessed what awaited German prisoners in Soviet hands, feared what surrender might mean. U-530 was one of these submarines. Commissioned in October 1942, it was a Type 9 C/40, a long-range submarine designed for extended patrols, far from European waters. These boats were larger than the more common Type 7 U-boats, with greater fuel capacity and operational range. They were designed to operate in the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, even as far as the Pacific. They could remain at sea for 4 months without refueling. Otto Wehrmuth had taken command of U-530 in January 1945. At 24, he was young for a submarine commander, but by the war's end, the German Navy was desperately short of experienced officers. The veterans who had led the U-boat campaign in its glory years were mostly dead, killed in the brutal attrition that had claimed so many. The new generation of commanders were competent but inexperienced. Vermuth had been a watch officer on other submarines before being given his own command. He was capable, by all accounts, but he lacked the years of experience that earlier commanders had brought to their positions. In mid-April 1945, U-530 was stationed at Kristiansand, Norway, one of the last operational U-boat bases. The submarine had just completed repairs and was preparing for what would normally have been a routine patrol. But nothing was routine anymore. The military situation was deteriorating by the hour. Soviet forces were in Berlin. British and American armies were deep into Germany. The war's end was not a question of if, but when. Wehrmacht received orders to put to sea. The exact nature of these orders has never been fully established because U-530's war diary was destroyed before the submarine surrendered. According to Wehrmacht's later testimony, he was ordered to conduct an anti-shipping patrol in the North Atlantic. But this explanation never made complete sense. By late April 1945, sending a submarine on a standard patrol was pointless. Allied shipping dominated the Atlantic completely. U-boats were being sunk at catastrophic rates. Launching a patrol in the war's final days accomplished nothing militarily. The timing suggests something different. U-530 departed Kristiansand sometime between April 19th and April 22nd, 1945. The exact date was never confirmed because all records were destroyed. What is certain is that the submarine was at sea when Germany surrendered on May 8th. Whether Wehrmacht received the surrender order remains unclear. He claimed his radio equipment was damaged and that he was operating under radio silence, standard procedure for U-boats on patrol. Allied investigators were skeptical, but the claim was never definitively disproven. What is clear is that at some point after May 8th, Otto Wehrmacht learned that Germany had surrendered. He may have received delayed German naval communications. He certainly would have intercepted Allied broadcasts announcing the war's end. And at that moment, thousands of miles from any European port, commanding a submarine that represented a defeated nation, he made a decision. He would not surrender to Allied forces in Europe. He would sail to Argentina. The decision to head for Argentina was not random. Argentina had maintained official neutrality for most of the war, only declaring war on Germany in March 1945 when the outcome was no longer in doubt. More importantly, Argentina had a substantial German immigrant population dating back to the 19th century. There were German communities throughout the country, particularly in Buenos Aires and the Patagonian South. German was spoken, German culture was maintained, and crucially, Argentina had a reputation, deserved or not, for treating Axis military personnel relatively well. During the war, several German merchant vessels had been interned in Argentine ports after being caught there when hostilities began. Their crews had been treated correctly, their ships impounded but not seized. While Argentine neutrality applied equally to both sides in theory, it was widely perceived as being more sympathetic to the Axis than to the Allies. This perception wasn't entirely fair, but it was widespread among German military personnel looking for anywhere that might offer refuge. For Wehrmacht and his crew, Argentina represented something that Europe no longer offered: the possibility of survival without immediate imprisonment, possible execution, or being handed over to Soviet forces. The crew of U-530 had discussed their options. According to later testimony, some crewmen wanted to surrender in Norway or Germany. Others advocated for scuttling the submarine and trying to disappear into the chaos of post-war Europe. But Wehrmacht made the final decision. They would sail to Argentina. The crew, facing their commander's authority in the closed world of a submarine, accepted his choice. The voyage that followed was one of the longest and most difficult ever undertaken by a German submarine. From Norwegian waters to Argentina is over 8,000 nautical miles. For a submarine designed primarily for underwater operations, making such a journey required surfacing regularly to run diesel engines, recharge batteries, and ventilate the boat. Every moment on the surface was a moment of vulnerability. Allied air patrols covered vast areas of the Atlantic. Allied ships operated freely. Any U-boat spotted would be attacked without warning. U-530 sailed south, avoiding shipping lanes, running submerged during daylight hours whenever possible, surfacing at night to make progress on diesel power. The crew maintained strict discipline because the alternative was death or capture. They ate carefully rationed provisions. They breathed stale air recycled through primitive scrubbers. They lived in constant tension, knowing that discovery meant the end. Life aboard a Type 9 submarine was brutal even under normal circumstances. The boat was just over 76 meters long and barely 6 meters wide at its widest point. Space inside was at an absolute premium. Every available surface was covered with equipment, pipes, valves, gauges. The crew slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, in spaces barely larger than coffins. Privacy didn't exist. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, cooking, and the chemical toilets that could only be flushed under specific conditions. For the crew of U-530, these conditions lasted 86 days. 86 days of constant alertness, of watching for aircraft or ships, of diving repeatedly when threats appeared, of wondering if the next depth charge or torpedo would be the one that killed them. The psychological strain was immense. These men were not sailing toward victory, or even toward a clear purpose. They were fleeing. They were survivors of a lost war, gambling that they could cross an ocean undetected and find refuge in a neutral port. The submarine crossed the equator. It passed through the South Atlantic, through waters where years earlier, U-boats had hunted Allied convoys with success. Now those same waters were patrolled by Allied forces hunting the hunters. U-530 avoided all contact, all detection. They saw merchant ships on the horizon and submerged. They heard aircraft overhead and went deep. They celebrated no victories because they sought none. Their only goal was survival. As they approached Argentine waters in early July, the crew must have felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the voyage was nearly over, that they had crossed the Atlantic without being sunk. Dread about what awaited them. Would Argentina grant them asylum? Would they be handed over to Allied authorities immediately? Would they face trial, imprisonment, execution? They had no way of knowing. On the morning of July 10th, 1945, U-530 surfaced off Mar del Plata and requested permission to enter the harbour. The response must have felt surreal after nearly 3 months at sea. They were granted permission. Argentine vessels escorted them in. And when they finally tied up at the dock, the crew emerged into daylight, into fresh air, into a world where the war was over, and they had somehow survived it. The arrival of U-530 triggered an immediate international incident. Within hours, American and British intelligence officers were demanding access to the crew and the submarine. The Argentine government, caught between its official neutrality and pressure from the Allies, granted the requests. The interrogations began immediately and would continue for weeks. American naval intelligence took the lead. They brought translators, submarine experts, intelligence analysts. They questioned Vermuth and his crew individually and in groups, checking stories for consistency, looking for contradictions, searching for any indication that the submarine had been on a mission beyond simple flight. The questions focused on several key issues. First, what had U-530 been doing between leaving Norway in mid-April and arriving in Argentina in early July? The voyage should have taken perhaps 6 weeks at most. What accounted for the additional time? Vermuth's explanation was consistent. They had travelled slowly, cautiously, avoiding all contact with other vessels, spending most of their time submerged or drifting to conserve fuel. The extra time was simply the result of extreme caution. Second, what had happened to the submarine's weapons, ammunition, and war diary? Vermuth stated that he had ordered all weapons and ammunition jettisoned at sea before approaching Argentina. This was plausible. A submarine entering a neutral port with active weapons could be seized as a legitimate military target. Disposing of weapons and ammunition demonstrated that the submarine was no longer a combatant. The war diary, Vermuth claimed, had been destroyed along with all classified documents to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. This too was plausible and consistent with standard operating procedure. Third, and most critically, had the submarine carried any passengers or cargo beyond the standard crew complement? This was the question that obsessed Allied intelligence. By July 1945, the hunt for Nazi war criminals was intensifying. Adolf Hitler was dead, his body identified through dental records by Soviet forces. But many high-ranking Nazis remained unaccounted for. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, had disappeared. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, was missing. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, had vanished in the chaos of Berlin's fall. Dozens of others were on the run. The possibility that U-530 had carried escaping Nazi officials to South America was taken seriously. Argentina already had a reputation, fair or not, as a haven for Nazi fugitives. The country's large German population, combined with a government that had maintained friendly relations with Germany until the war's final weeks, made it a logical destination for anyone fleeing Allied justice. Vermuth and his crew denied carrying any passengers. They stated repeatedly that only the standard 54 crew members had been aboard. The submarine's cramped quarters made concealing passengers virtually impossible. The crew would have known. And when questioned individually, their stories remained consistent. No passengers. No cargo beyond provisions and fuel. No secret mission beyond the simple desire to survive. Allied investigators examined U-530 thoroughly. They measured its fuel tanks and calculated consumption rates. The numbers supported Vermuth's account. The fuel remaining in the tanks was consistent with a direct voyage from Norway to Argentina with the standard crew. Carrying passengers would have required provisions beyond what the submarine could reasonably hold for such a long voyage. The physical evidence supported the crew's story, but suspicions remained. The timing was too convenient. The choice of Argentina too deliberate. The disposal of all records too thorough. Intelligence officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden, even if they couldn't prove what that something was. And then, on August 17th, 1945, 5 weeks after U-530's arrival, a second German U-boat surfaced in Mar del Plata harbor. U-977, commanded by Oberleutnant Heinz Schaefer, had been at sea even longer than U-530. 108 days, Schaefer reported. His story was remarkably similar to Vermuth's. He had departed Kristiansand, Norway, on May 2nd, 1945, the day before Germany's surrender. He claimed he had received no clear orders and had decided to sail to Argentina rather than surrender in Europe. He too had disposed of all weapons and classified documents at sea. His crew of 32 men also claimed they carried no passengers and no special cargo. The arrival of a second submarine with an almost identical story transformed Allied suspicions into something approaching certainty that some kind of organized escape operation had taken place. 2 U-boats leaving Norway within days of each other, both choosing Argentina as their destination, both disposing of all records, both arriving weeks apart in the same Argentine port. It couldn't be coincidence. Schaefer's interrogation was even more intensive than Vermuth's had been. Intelligence officers noted discrepancies in his account. His explanation for the voyage's length didn't fully add up. He claimed to have spent 66 days traveling underwater to avoid detection, surfacing only when absolutely necessary. This was technically possible, but would have pushed the submarine's systems and crew to their absolute limits. Living conditions aboard a submerged submarine were horrific. The air became increasingly foul. Carbon dioxide levels rose. The heat from machinery and packed bodies became unbearable. Doing this for 66 consecutive days seemed almost superhuman. Yet Schaefer and his crew maintained their story. They had travelled slowly, carefully, spending as much time as possible submerged. They had avoided all contact with other vessels. They had made it to Argentina through caution and luck. And like U-530, they insisted they carried nothing beyond their crew. The interrogations produced volumes of testimony, but no smoking gun. No evidence emerged that either submarine had carried passengers. No documents were found linking the submarines to any organised escape network. The physical evidence, the fuel consumption calculations, the provisions remaining aboard, all supported the basic narratives provided by both commanders. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Intelligence officers knew that. And the American and British public, reading sensationalized newspaper accounts of mysterious German submarines appearing in Argentina weeks after the war's end, drew their own conclusions. The submarines must have been carrying something or someone important. That was the only explanation that made sense. The stories grew in the telling. Some newspapers claimed the submarines had carried high-ranking Nazi officials. Others suggested they had transported looted gold or stolen art. The most dramatic accounts claimed they had carried Adolf Hitler himself, despite the fact that Soviet forces had already identified Hitler's body in Berlin, and despite the complete absence of any evidence supporting such claims. Argentine authorities, embarrassed by the international attention and pressure from the Allies, eventually turned both U-boat crews over to American custody. The submarines themselves were studied, then eventually scrapped. The crews were held in prisoner of war camps for several months before being repatriated to occupied Germany in 1946. Heinz Schaefer, U-977's commander, eventually published a memoir in 1952 titled U-977, 66 Days Underwater. The book provided a detailed account of his voyage and attempted to dispel the myths that had grown around his submarine's journey. But by then, the myths had taken on lives of their own. They had merged with other post-war legends about Nazi survival, about secret bases in Antarctica, about advanced technology hidden away until the Reich could rise again. The submarine's stories became entangled with conspiracy theories about Operation Highjump, the massive American Antarctic expedition of 1946 and 1947. Some theorists claimed the submarines had been carrying cargo to secret Antarctic bases. Others suggested they had been scouting locations for Nazi escape routes. The fact that both submarines had sailed through South Atlantic waters relatively near Antarctica seemed too coincidental. None of these theories held up under scrutiny. The submarine's fuel consumption made Antarctic voyages impossible. Their navigation logs, when examined by experts, showed routes consistent with direct voyages from Norway to Argentina. The crew's testimonies remained consistent across years of questioning. But facts struggled against the power of narrative. The story of Nazi submarines mysteriously appearing in Argentina was too compelling to die, simply because it wasn't supported by evidence. What actually happened is less dramatic than the myths, but more interesting in what it reveals about human nature and the chaos of war's end. Otto Vermuth and Heinz Schaefer were not masterminds of elaborate escape operations. They were young submarine commanders facing an impossible situation. Their nation had collapsed. Their military had ceased to exist. They commanded vessels that represented the losing side of history's greatest conflict. They faced the choice of surrendering immediately to forces that might execute them, or hand them over to Soviet vengeance, or trying to reach somewhere, anywhere, that might offer a chance at survival. They chose survival. They made decisions that seemed rational from the perspective of men in their circumstances, even if those decisions looked suspicious to intelligence officers investigating from the outside. They sailed to Argentina because it offered the possibility of being treated as refugees rather than as war criminals. They disposed of weapons and documents because entering a neutral port, armed, would have justified seizing their submarines by force. They maintained their stories because their stories were true, even if those stories were incomplete. The incompleteness is what fed the myths. Wormuth and Schaefer never fully explained their thinking. They never revealed what discussions happened among their crews, what fears motivated their decisions, what rumors they had heard about the fates of other U-boat crews who had surrendered in Europe. This silence, this gap in the narrative, became the space where speculation flourished. Modern historians have access to documents that weren't available in 1945. Decoded German naval communications, released decades later, show no evidence of special missions assigned to U-530 or U-977. Post-war interrogations of German naval commanders, including Admiral Dönitz himself, revealed no knowledge of organized escape operations using submarines. The physical evidence, re-examined with modern forensic techniques, continues to support the conclusion that both submarines carried only their crews. But historical analysis struggles against the enduring appeal of mystery. The story of German submarines appearing mysteriously in Argentina, possibly carrying Nazi fugitives or treasure, possibly linked to secret bases in Antarctica, continues to circulate online and in popular culture. It appears in books, documentaries, websites. It merges with other conspiracy theories about Nazi survival and secret technologies. It becomes part of a larger mythology about the war's end, about hidden truths that governments don't want revealed. The persistence of these myths tells us something important about how we process historical trauma. World War II was so vast, so destructive, so full of genuine horrors, that somehow the idea of its end being equally dramatic seems necessary. The notion that the Third Reich simply collapsed, that its leaders mostly died ignominiously or were captured and tried, that its submarines surrendered or were sunk without great final battles, feels anticlimactic. The myths provide the drama that messy reality didn't deliver. They also reveal how gaps in historical records become filled with imagination. The destruction of U-530 and U-977's war diaries, done for understandable reasons by crews trying to protect classified information, created an information void. That void was filled not with careful historical reconstruction, but with speculation that fit existing narratives about Nazi escape networks and secret weapons programs. And the myths persist, because they serve psychological functions beyond mere entertainment. They provide simple explanations for complex historical questions. They offer the comfort of believing that important truths are hidden, rather than accepting that some questions simply don't have satisfying answers. They create communities of believers who share special knowledge that mainstream historians supposedly ignore. The true story of U-530 and U-977 is ultimately about something more universal than submarines or Nazis or conspiracy theories. It's about men facing impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Otto Wermuth was 24 years old when he decided to sail across the Atlantic rather than surrender in Europe. Heinz Schaefer was 25. They were barely adults, commanding vessels in a war they hadn't started, representing a regime whose crimes they may or may not have fully understood. They made choices that seemed rational from inside the closed world of a submarine in the war's chaotic final days. They prioritized the survival of their crews over immediate surrender. They sought refuge in a neutral country rather than face uncertain fates in occupied Europe. They destroyed records because keeping them endangered their chances of being granted asylum. These were not heroic choices. They were not villainous choices. They were human choices, made under pressure, with incomplete information, by young men who wanted to survive. The crews who sailed aboard U-530 and U-977, the 54 men on one submarine and 32 on the other, were mostly teenagers and men in their early 20s. They had joined the Kriegsmarine before the war or early in the conflict. They had been trained for submarine warfare without being asked whether they agreed with the Nazi regime's ideology. They had served in the most dangerous branch of the most dangerous service in the most destructive war in human history. And they had survived when 3 out of 4 of their comrades had not. When they emerged from their submarines in Mar del Plata harbor in the summer of 1945, they stepped into a world that would spend decades trying to understand what they represented. Were they refugees fleeing a defeated nation? Were they war criminals escaping justice? Were they participants in some vast conspiracy? The answer, almost certainly, is that they were simply men who had been to war and wanted to go home, even though home no longer existed. The submarines themselves were scrapped. The crews were repatriated. Most returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives in the occupation zones that would become West and East Germany. Some emigrated to South America or North America. They got jobs, married, had families. They became mechanics, teachers, shopkeepers, businessmen. They became, in other words, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Heinz Schaefer's memoir, published in 1952, became a bestseller in Germany. It provided a detailed, largely credible account of U-977's voyage and helped establish the basic facts of what happened. Otto Wermuth never published his story. He gave occasional interviews to historians, but largely avoided public attention. Both men lived long lives, Schaefer dying in 1987, Wermuth in 1992. In their final years, both men expressed frustration with the conspiracy theories that continued to surround their wartime experiences. They had told the truth as they understood it. They had been investigated, interrogated, and cleared. Yet the myths persisted, growing more elaborate with each retelling, incorporating elements that had nothing to do with what actually happened. This is perhaps the final irony of the U-530 and U-977 story. The truth, when it finally emerged through decades of investigation and documentation, was less exciting than the myths, but more meaningful. 2 young submarine commanders, facing the collapse of everything they had known, made desperate decisions to save their crews. They sailed across an ocean, avoided detection, and reached a neutral port. They survived. That should have been enough. Survival, in the context of a war that killed over 70 million people, was an achievement in itself. But the human need for mystery, for hidden meanings, for dramatic narratives, transformed their survival story into something else entirely. Today, the facts are clear for anyone willing to examine them. The declassified documents are available in archives. The interrogation reports can be read. The fuel consumption calculations can be verified. The navigation logs, reconstructed from crew testimony and Allied intelligence, show routes consistent with direct voyages from Norway to Argentina. No evidence of passengers, special cargo, or secret missions has ever emerged, despite 80 years of investigation and speculation. Yet, the myths endure. They endure because they offer something that facts sometimes cannot: a sense of hidden truth, of secrets beneath the surface, of knowing what others don't know. They endure because they connect to broader anxieties about power, about evil, about the possibility that the monsters we thought were defeated might still be lurking somewhere, waiting. The German submarine that vanished and reappeared in Argentina is no longer mysterious. The mystery was solved decades ago through patient investigation and careful analysis. What remains is not mystery but mythology. And mythology serves different purposes than history. It reflects our fears and our fascinations more than it reflects what actually happened. Otto Vermuth and Heinz Schaefer were not mystery men. They were submarine commanders who made difficult choices in terrible circumstances. Their submarines were not vessels of conspiracy, but vehicles of escape. Their crews were not participants in elaborate plots, but young men trying to survive. That's the truth. It's less exciting than the myths, but it's more honest. And in the end, honesty about history matters more than excitement. Because when we replace historical truth with comforting or thrilling mythology, we lose something important. We lose the ability to understand what actually happened, to learn from it, to ensure that the mistakes and horrors of the past aren't repeated. The submarines are gone, scrapped decades ago. The men who sailed aboard them are gone too, dead of old age. What remains is the historical record, the documented facts, and the myths that refuse to die. The choice of which to believe says more about us than it does about what happened in the summer of 1945, when 2 German submarines surfaced off Argentina, and young men stepped onto dry land after voyages that should have been impossible. They made it. They survived. That should be enough.